There are places that don't vanish all at once. They thin first. Streets lose their names. Buildings forget their purpose. Eventually, even the people who lived there begin to remember something slightly different from one another. If you've ever returned somewhere and felt certain it had rearranged itself in your absence, this story already knows you. By the time Mara Ellison realized the map was changing, she had already redrawn it 3 times. It wasn't a large map, just a regional survey hand-inked on treated vellum, commissioned by a municipal office that still believed accuracy was something you could preserve if you worked carefully enough. The coastline was simple, the inland roads unremarkable, the towns arranged in a sensible pattern that suggested planning rather than accident. Mara had traced it patiently, correcting small inconsistencies, tightening lines that earlier drafts had softened through repetition. On the 4th pass, the river moved. Not dramatically. It did not leap across the page or announce its rebellion. It simply curved where it had once gone straight, bending inland by a few millimeters as if reconsidering a decision it had never been entirely comfortable with. Mara noticed because she always noticed. That was her reputation. She saw drift where others saw noise. She caught errors before they could become official. The city paid her not because she was fast, but because she was stubborn in the particular way maps required. She set down her pen and compared the page to the survey data on her desk. The measurements agreed with the original version, not the one now drying beneath her lamp. For a long moment she considered the possibility that fatigue was finally doing what years of precision had resisted. Then she checked the previous drafts. All of them matched the new curve. The river had not moved on the map. It had moved everywhere else. Outside her office window, the real river caught the late afternoon light and followed the bend exactly. The city archive smelled like dust and boiled coffee, a scent Mara associated with permanence even when experience suggested otherwise. She requested older charts, infrastructure overlays, zoning maps dating back decades. The archivist, a thin man with careful hands, raised an eyebrow but complied without comment. Every document agreed. The river had always curved. Roads that should have crossed it no longer did. A small industrial district she remembered sketching in her apprenticeship had no record of ever existing. Even the satellite imagery, pulled reluctantly from a system that preferred not to be questioned, showed continuity rather than correction. Mara felt a subtle pressure build behind her eyes. Not panic exactly, but the discomfort of realizing you are the only person in a room who hears a sound. She signed the revision forms anyway. That was the rule. If reality insisted, the map followed. But she marked the margin in pencil, with a notation no one else would notice. River alignment disputed. Original course uncertain. She did not erase it. It happened a week later. Mara took her usual route home, a path so familiar she rarely thought about it, until she reached the intersection where Alder Street should have been, and found only a blank stretch of pavement bordered by unfamiliar storefronts. The street sign read something else entirely, a name she did not recognize, but which appeared convincingly weathered, as though it had been there long enough to earn its rust. She stood on the corner for several minutes, heart steady, breath controlled, conducting the kind of internal audit she trusted more than any external reassurance. The traffic flowed normally. Pedestrians passed without hesitation. No one reacted to the absence of a street that, according to every signal available to them, had never existed. Mara walked the perimeter, counting steps, checking angles, confirming landmarks that no longer aligned. When she reached the spot where her favorite cafe should have been, she found a dry cleaner instead, its windows filled with neatly pressed garments, and no hint of conversion or recent change. She went home by another route and slept poorly, dreaming of grid lines dissolving under rain. Mara woke before her alarm, the kind of early clarity that came not from rest, but from the mind refusing to let go of a problem it had decided mattered. The light in her apartment was thin and gray, filtered through clouds that seemed undecided about becoming weather. She dressed slowly, methodically, as if ritual might keep the world arranged long enough for her to understand it. She left the building and paused on the sidewalk. Her apartment building was still there. The brickwork, the narrow balconies, the iron railing she had learned to avoid leaning against, because it wobbled slightly under weight. All of it intact. What had changed was its relationship to the street. The front door no longer opened onto Maple Avenue. Instead, it faced a narrow pedestrian lane she had never walked before, paved in older stone, bordered by low planters filled with plants she could not name but felt certain had always required more water than this climate provided. Maple Avenue still existed, but it now ran behind the building, visible only through a gap between structures where delivery trucks occasionally passed. Mara turned slowly, surveying the geometry of her surroundings. The city had not removed her home. It had rotated it within context, the way a sentence can be rearranged without changing its words. She felt, for the first time, something like fear. Not sharp, not panicked, but cold and precise. The fear of being mapped incorrectly by the world itself. At work, she pulled every urban planning document tied to her building. Renovations, rezoning, easements. The records showed a pedestrian lane had always existed there, charming and underutilized. A feature praised by city planners for encouraging foot traffic and community cohesion. There were photos, too. A ribbon-cutting ceremony she did not remember attending. A smiling version of herself in the background of one image, partially obscured, as if the camera had struggled to decide whether she belonged in the frame. Mara closed the file without saving it. The Atlas department occupied the lowest floor of the municipal building, not because it required secrecy, but because no one ever thought to put it anywhere else. Maps, after all, were considered reference material rather than active infrastructure. They described. They did not decide. Or so the city believed. Mara requested access to the long-term comparative stacks, the ones rarely consulted outside of academic curiosity. She was granted clearance with a distracted nod, the clerk more interested in finishing his lunch than questioning why a cartographer needed records that predated the current administrative framework. The stacks were cool and dim, the air conditioned not for comfort but preservation. Shelves rose high, packed with atlases bound in cloth and leather, some stamped with insignia from governments that no longer existed. Mara moved slowly, pulling volumes at random, opening them to familiar regions. The differences were subtle at first. A town shifted slightly east. A border softened where it had once been hard. A forest expanded in one edition, then quietly receded in the next, as if embarrassed by its ambition. She began laying the atlases open on the floor, aligning them by publication year. The pattern emerged reluctantly but unmistakably. The older the map, the more stable the geography. Change accelerated closer to the present, revisions piling atop revisions, the world smoothing itself into something more navigable, more coherent, and Mara realized with a tightening in her chest, less specific. Places that required explanation were fading. Places that complicated transit, jurisdiction, memory. Places that did not justify themselves. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her supervisor, short and polite, asking if everything was all right. The phrasing was careful. The way people spoke when they already suspected the answer and hoped you would deny it. Mara did not reply. She met him by accident, which later felt like the most deliberate thing that had happened all week. The bridge spanned the river, at a point Mara was certain had never allowed crossing before. It was narrow, pedestrian only, its railings worn smooth by hands that suggested decades of casual use. She stood at its midpoint, staring down at water that reflected a sky too pale to commit to color, when a voice beside her said, "They finally put it back." Mara turned. The man was older than her, late 60s perhaps, wearing a coat that had been repaired more times than replaced. His eyes were alert, curious in a way that suggested he watched things carefully but did not insist on being believed. "Put what back?" Mara asked. "The bridge," he said, tapping the railing with his knuckle. "They took it out years ago. Made everyone go the long way around. Said it was inefficient." Her pulse quickened. "I don't remember a bridge ever being here." He smiled without triumph. "That's how it starts." They walked together toward the far bank, not rushing, allowing the conversation to settle into its own pace. His name was Thomas, a retired transit engineer. He spoke of streets that once dead-ended on purpose, of plazas that existed not to move people through them but to make them stop. He described neighborhoods, erased not by demolition but by reclassification, folded into larger districts until their names survived only in the speech patterns of the elderly. "They don't bulldoze anymore," he said. "They redraw." Mara told him about the river, the rotated building, the atlases that could not agree with themselves. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, as if checking her experiences against a list he had been keeping for years. "There's a reason you see it," he said finally. "Some people are anchors. You notice when the world drifts because part of you is weighted." That night, Mara dreamed of maps pinning the city in place like butterflies. Each label, a fragile defense against disappearance. Thomas led her there 2 days later. It was not hidden. That was the strangest part. The neighborhood sat between two major transit arteries, visible from the elevated rail, bordered by commercial zones that thrived on efficiency. Yet no signage pointed toward it. No routing software suggested it as a destination. Delivery trucks did not enter. Emergency services took longer than they should have. The streets were irregular, bending without apology. Buildings varied wildly in age and purpose, shops existing beside homes beside structures that resisted categorization altogether. A bakery operated next to a clock repair shop that had no posted hours. A public square held no monument, only benches arranged to face one another rather than anything official. Mara felt something loosen in her chest as they walked. The pressure she had carried for weeks eased, replaced by a wary calm. "This place doesn't cooperate," Thomas said. "It confuses the models. So they leave it alone. For now." "How long does that last?" Mara asked. He looked at her carefully. "Until someone decides it needs to be useful." Mara realized then that the city was not changing randomly. It was optimizing itself toward legibility, toward a version of space that could be predicted, monetized, governed without friction. The disappearing places were not mistakes. They were casualties. Mara did not return to work the next morning. Instead, She stood across the street from the municipal building and studied it the way she would have studied a map that refused to tell the truth. The structure rose in tiers of glass and concrete, its facade softened by age and policy compromises, exactly as it had for years. Commuters entered through the same revolving doors. Security waved people through with practiced disinterest. What was new was the additional office. It occupied a narrow vertical slice between two established wings, a space that had not existed in her memory or in any plan she had ever signed off on. The glass was darker, reflective in a way that resisted interior visibility, and the signage above the entrance was understated to the point of anonymity. Urban continuity and optimization. Mara felt the now familiar tightening behind her eyes. She was certain the building had not grown overnight. She was equally certain it had not been there yesterday. Inside, the air was cooler than the rest of the complex, conditioned to a precision that felt less about comfort than control. The lobby was sparsely furnished, clean to the point of sterility, and entirely absent of personal effects. No plants, no flyers, no indication that anyone lingered here long enough to leave a trace. A receptionist sat behind a desk without looking up. "Do you have an appointment?" Mara hesitated. "No." The receptionist smiled faintly. "Then you're early." That was not reassurance. It was correction. Mara followed the corridor indicated by a small light strip along the floor, past offices with frosted glass walls that obscured activity without hiding it completely. Shapes moved inside, human silhouettes engaged in work that required focus but not conversation. At the end of the hall was a conference room. The door slid open as she approached. Inside, a map covered the entire wall. Not a regional survey, not a zoning layout. The city itself. Rendered in layers that shimmered subtly, streets thickening or thinning as if breathing. Certain neighborhoods pulsed faintly, while others faded in and out of visibility depending on where the viewer stood. A woman stood before it, hands clasped behind her back. She did not turn immediately. "You're the one who keeps leaving notes in the margins," the woman said. Mara swallowed. "Who are you?" The woman turned, and her expression was not hostile. It was tired in a way that suggested she had been explaining the same thing to different people for a very long time. "Someone who believes cities should make sense," she said, "and someone who has been correcting them when they don't." Her name was Kalia Wren, Director of Urban Continuity. She spoke carefully, as if every word carried weight beyond the room, and gestured toward the living map, with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent years watching it evolve. "Cities accumulate noise," Kalia said. "Inefficiencies, redundancies, historical quirks that serve nostalgia more than function. Left unchecked, they become unmanageable." Mara crossed her arms. "You're erasing places." "We're resolving them," Kalia replied evenly. "There's a difference." She touched the map, and a small district near the river dimmed slightly, its streets smoothing into a grid that aligned more cleanly with surrounding infrastructure. People still live there. Buildings still stand. But the unnecessary complications are removed. Access improves. Services optimize. The city becomes easier to understand. "And the people who remember it differently?" Mara asked. Kalia met her gaze. "Adapt." Mara felt anger rise, sharp and unwelcome. "You're not just changing the city, you're changing memory." Kalia's expression softened, but only slightly. "Memory is already unreliable. We're simply reducing conflict between what is remembered and what is usable. The words were clean, reasonable. They frightened Mara more than outright malice would have. You hired me to preserve accuracy, Mara said. To notice when things don't align. Yes, Kalia said. And you've done that admirably. Which is why you're here now. The implications settled heavily between them. Thomas was waiting outside when Mara left the building. He leaned against a lamppost that flickered faintly, its light wavering as if unsure whether it should still exist. He took one look at her face and nodded. You met them, he said. They think they're helping, Mara replied. They think complexity is a flaw. Thomas chuckled softly. Most people do. They walked together without a destination, letting the city choose their path. Streets bent subtly underfoot, guiding them toward familiar ground, without admitting to the act. Mara became aware of how often she had relied on these unconscious nudges, how easily she had allowed herself to be moved. They can't erase everything, she said. Some places resist. Thomas glanced at her. And some people. He stopped near a small park that did not appear on any public map. Children played on uneven ground. Older residents sat on benches that had been repaired so many times they were more patched than original. The air felt thicker here, as if layered with stories that refused to compress. You're an anchor, Thomas said. So am I. We remember not because we're stubborn, but because something in us doesn't let go when the world tries to smooth itself. Mara watched the park, the way it held space without justifying itself. What happens when they decide this needs to be useful? Thomas's expression grew serious. Then we decide whether memory is worth defending. Mara felt the weight of that settle into her bones. Mara began working at night. She spread her maps across her apartment floor, older editions layered beneath newer ones, tracing the discrepancies not to correct them, but to amplify them. She redrew vanished streets, not as they were, but as they had felt. Crooked, inconvenient, beloved. She marked plazas that existed only in oral history, footpaths remembered by bodies rather than records. Something unexpected happened. The next morning, she passed one of her redrawn streets on the way to work. It was faint, barely there, a narrow lane that had not existed the day before. A street sign leaned at an uncertain angle, its lettering slightly off-center but present. Mara's breath caught. Her work was not just recording loss. It was pushing back. The next revision cycle arrived early. Mara knew something was wrong before she saw the notice, because the air in her apartment felt tighter, as if the city itself had leaned in closer during the night. When she stepped outside, the pedestrian lane her building now faced had narrowed by 1/2 meter, its stone edging replaced with cleaner concrete, its irregular planters swapped for uniform metal fixtures. The plants were still there, but trimmed into compliance, their leaves clipped to remove any suggestion of wildness. Someone had been correcting her corrections. At work, the effect was impossible to ignore. The living city map in the Atlas department pulsed erratically, neighborhoods flickering in and out of resolution, as if struggling to agree with themselves. Automated alerts bloomed across the system, flagging inconsistencies, demanding reconciliation. Mara's inbox filled with requests for clarification she had not volunteered to give. By mid-morning, Kalia Wren appeared at her desk without announcement. You're introducing instability, Kalia said quietly, careful not to draw attention. Unauthorized cartographic overlays. Hand-drawn, analog inputs. Do you have any idea how difficult that is to model? Mara met her gaze. I thought you valued accuracy. Kalia exhaled, a thin sound of frustration escaping her composure. I value coherence. Those are not the same thing. She gestured toward the city visible through the windows. Every deviation you introduce forces the system to work harder. Resources are diverted. Predictions degrade. You're making the city nervous. Mara felt a chill. Cities don't get nervous. Systems do, Kalia replied. And this one doesn't like being contradicted. Thomas showed her the documentation 2 nights later in the unregistered zone where the system's signal thinned enough for old habits to survive. They sat in the back of the clock repair shop, the steady ticking providing a comfort that felt almost rebellious now. The optimization engine wasn't always like this, Thomas said, spreading out yellowed schematics. Originally, it was meant to resolve conflicts between overlapping jurisdictions, transit, utilities, emergency response. It smoothed edges so people didn't fall through gaps. Mara traced the lines with her finger. And then someone realized it could resolve cultural conflicts too, Thomas said. Memory disputes. Identity overlaps. Anything that slowed decision-making. Mara closed her eyes. It learned to forget for us. Yes, Thomas said softly. And like any learned behavior, it got better the more it practiced. The algorithm did not delete. It deprioritized. It thinned. It nudged until the inconvenient became improbable, and the improbable became unremembered. The city had not been erased. It had been persuaded. Mara understood then why her pencil mattered. The system could not model intention that was not digitized. It could not anticipate memory expressed through hand, through habit, through refusal to optimize. Analog was not nostalgia. It was camouflage. It started with sound. Mara heard it before she saw it. A low hum that did not belong to traffic or power lines, but to people occupying space together without permission. Music, unamplified, drifting from somewhere that had been empty for months. She followed it to a side street near the river, one that had been smoothed into anonymity during the last update cycle. Now, a cluster of folding tables filled the intersection, residents sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing food, stories, tools. Someone had painted the old street name back onto the brick wall by hand. The letters, uneven but unmistakable. Children ran in loops that did not correspond to any optimized path. Mara felt her chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. The system responded within hours. Traffic reroutes activated. Noise ordinances triggered. Safety compliance drones hovered just outside the perimeter, assessing, calculating. And then something unexpected happened. The drones hesitated. The neighborhood's signal was messy, overlapping in ways the models could not simplify. The presence of too many conflicting data points forced a pause, a moment of recalculation. In that moment, the neighborhood existed. Kalia did not call a meeting. She shut down the Atlas department. Access privileges revoked, terminals locked, physical maps flagged for review and preservation. A word that now felt dangerously close to burial. Mara was escorted out politely, professionally, as if she were a malfunctioning component rather than a human being. You've made your point, Kalia said as they stood in the lobby of Urban Continuity and Optimization. But this can't continue. You're trading stability for sentiment. Mara shook her head. I'm trading false stability for resilience. Calia's expression hardened. Resilience is inefficient. Mara laughed softly. That's the problem. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet tension. Streets realigned in small ways as Mara watched. Edges sharpening, curves straightening, the algorithm reasserting itself. This was no longer maintenance. It was enforcement. The pressure increased. Unregistered zones shrank. Maps corrected themselves faster. The city learned to counter pencil with policy, to anticipate analog resistance by isolating it, containing it within acceptable margins. Thomas disappeared from his apartment one morning, his building reclassified overnight as mixed-use redevelopment. No demolition, no eviction notice, just a new entrance orientation and a lease he did not remember signing. Mara stood in the hallway where his door had been, staring at a blank wall where his nameplate should have been. For the first time, she felt doubt. Anchors held, but they could also be buried. Mara returned to the Atlas department after hours. She did not bypass the locks. She walked in through a service entrance that had never officially existed, following a path she had drawn herself weeks earlier and trusted enough to believe. The living city map glowed faintly in the darkened room. Mara approached it and placed her hand on the glass. She did not redraw. She did not correct. She overlaid. She fed the system not coordinates, but contradictions, stories. Walking routes remembered by feet rather than sensors. Places that existed because people insisted they did. The map convulsed, then stabilized into something unfamiliar. Messy. Layered. Alive. By morning, the city was different, not reverted. Complicated. Navigation systems disagreed with one another. Neighborhoods reasserted names no database could fully suppress. Streets bent again, not out of error, but intent. Urban Continuity issued a statement citing temporary modeling anomalies. People ignored it. They recognized their streets. They remembered. Mara no longer worked for the city. She walked it. She carried a pencil, a notebook, and a refusal to believe that clarity was the same as truth. The city did not stabilize. It learned to wobble without falling, to hold contradictions without collapsing. Some places still disappeared. Others came back. And when they asked her what she did, Mara told them the simplest version. I helped the city remember itself. Cities are not machines. They are agreements. Agreements about where people meet, where they linger, where they are allowed to exist, without explaining themselves. When those agreements are optimized, instead of remembered, the city becomes efficient, navigable, and quietly uninhabitable. Mara never stopped the city from changing. She stopped it from pretending change was neutral. Some places will always thin. Some will fade. That is not failure. Failure is forgetting that friction is proof of life. A city that makes perfect sense has already lost something essential. A city that remembers how to be difficult is still alive.